Every woman offered him gold and power. She gave him a piece of bread, and he never forgot. The first thing Daniel Holt learned about the world was that it was not fair, and the second thing he learned was that nobody was coming to fix that. He was 7 years old when he understood this, not in the way children understand things, as a piece of information handed to them by adults, but in the deep, bone-level way that only comes from living inside a truth long enough for it to become part of you. His father, George Holt, came home from the factory that evening with a split lip and both hands shaking, and when Daniel asked what happened, his father said nothing. He sat at the table, put both hands flat against the wood as if checking that solid things still existed, and stared at a spot on the wall above the stove for a very long time. His mother, Carol, moved quietly around the kitchen. She did not ask questions either. She set a bowl in front of George, and George ate, and the silence in that small house on Fern Street was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that meant something had been broken and nobody had words large enough to cover the pieces. That night, Daniel lay in his bed and listened to the pipes in the walls and the wind outside, and the low murmur of his parents' voices from the room next to his. He could not make out the words. He did not need to. The tone told him everything. His mother's voice, careful and measured. His father's voice, lower and slower and carrying the specific exhaustion that is not tiredness from work, but tiredness from something closer to the chest. They lived in a part of Claremont, Ohio that people from the good side of town did not visit unless they were lost. The streets had names like Fern and Maple and Oak, the kind of names that suggested softness, but the softness was not there. The houses sat close together as if leaning on each other for support. The yards were small. The trees were mostly bare even in summer, because the soil was thin, and the shade from the taller buildings next to the main road blocked most of the light. Children played in the streets because there was nowhere else to play, and the parents watched from front steps because watching was cheaper than fencing. George Holt worked at the Claremont metal fabrication plant. He had worked there since he was 19 years old, which meant he had worked there for 21 years by the time Daniel turned 7, and in 21 years he had risen from floor worker to senior floor worker, which was less a promotion than a change of title. He still stood on the same floor. He still wore the same orange vest. He still came home with the same dust in the creases of his hands that no amount of washing ever fully removed. He was not a bitter man. This is important to understand, because bitterness would have been easier. A bitter man rails against things. A bitter man has an enemy, a system, a target for his anger, and that target, however unfair, gives the anger somewhere to go. George Holt was not bitter. He was resigned, which is a different and quieter thing, and in some ways harder to watch. He provided. That was how he understood his role, and he fulfilled it with a steadiness that Daniel would not appreciate until much later. There was always food. Not abundance, but food. The bills were always paid, if sometimes late. The heat stayed on through the Ohio winters, which could be vicious. The lights worked. There was a television in the living room, a used one, with a picture that rolled sometimes, but it worked. George Holt made sure of these things with the same quiet determination that he applied to everything, and he never once asked to be thanked for it. Carol Holt was a different kind of person. Where George carried the world in his shoulders, the rounding of them, the way they curved forward as if shielding something, Carol carried it in her eyes. She was a woman who noticed things. She noticed when the neighbor's cat had not come out in 3 days and left a small bowl of water by the fence just in case. She noticed when Daniel came home from school with something wrong in his face even when he said nothing was wrong. She noticed, and she responded, not always with words but always with presence. She cleaned houses on the north side of town 3 days a week. She took the bus there and back, which meant she left early and arrived home later than George on those days. And on those days Daniel let himself in with the key kept under the third brick of the front step, and made himself a peanut butter sandwich, and did his homework at the kitchen table, until one of them arrived. He was a quiet child. Not unhappy exactly, though there were stretches of gray in his childhood that he would not name until he was older, but interior. He watched more than he spoke. He had friends at school, the ordinary kind, the ones you walk home with and trade cards with and forget almost completely by the time you are 15. But his deepest company was his own thoughts. He read everything he could find. He went through the school library systematically, shelf by shelf, not because anyone told him to, but because books were free and they were full, and the world in them was larger than Fern Street. He discovered early that he was good at numbers, not just competent, genuinely good, in the way that feels less like skill and more like speaking a language you were born knowing. Numbers made sense to him when people did not. Numbers stayed where you put them. They did not change their meaning based on mood or context or who was asking. 2 plus 2 was 4 at 7 in the morning and 4 at midnight, in Ohio and anywhere else. whether you were rich or whether your father came home with a split lip from a foreman who had decided to make an example. His fourth-grade teacher, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich who wore the same 3 cardigans on a rotating schedule and had a patience that Daniel would later recognize as a form of love, noticed his ability. She started giving him extra problems. Not as punishment, the way extra work was sometimes given, but as gift. She would slide a sheet across his desk with a small nod that meant, "This one is for you." He always finished before anyone else. He never said so. He turned the paper over and waited. Mrs. Aldrich spoke to Carol after school one afternoon in October. Daniel sat in the hallway outside the classroom and listened through the gap in the door. Mrs. Aldrich said the word exceptional twice. She said the word opportunity once. Carol said thank you, and her voice had something in it that Daniel could not name at 7, but would name much later. It was the specific emotion of a mother hearing good news about her child while simultaneously calculating whether good news is something she can afford. Nothing changed immediately after that conversation. Life in the Holt house on Fern Street continued in its familiar rhythm. George to the factory, Carol to the north side or the kitchen, Daniel to school and then home, and then the kitchen table, and then whatever thin sleep came in a house where the walls were not thick enough to keep out the sounds of the street. But something had been planted. Daniel felt it without knowing what it was. A sense that there was somewhere to go, not a direction yet, just a direction. He was 9 when he started selling things. Small things first. Baseball cards he had found in a box at the church rummage sale, bought for 50 cents each and sold for $3 each to boys at school who wanted them badly enough to pay. Then he expanded. He started buying snacks in bulk from the grocery store on 4th Street, the kind of small bags of chips and candy that cost less per unit when you bought many, and selling them individually at school at a slight markup. He kept the money in a coffee can behind the loose brick in his bedroom wall. He did not tell his parents, not because he was ashamed, but because he was not sure how to explain it. It did not feel like misbehavior. It felt like solving a problem. He wanted more than he had, and more could be made from less if you understood where the gaps were. A teacher caught him once with the snacks and took them. Daniel did not argue. He sat in the principal's office and said, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, the teacher is right," and he was sorry, and he meant none of it except the last word, which he meant in the narrow sense that he was sorry he had been caught and would need to be more careful. The principal called his parents. George came in and sat across from the principal and listened. And when they left, George put his hand on Daniel's shoulder in the parking lot and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You are smarter than this place," and that was all he said. Daniel did not entirely understand it then. Later he would. It was not a compliment on the selling. It was something larger and quieter. A man telling his son that he saw him, that he understood the engine running inside the boy and did not want it extinguished, only aimed better. The years between 10 and 14 are the years that mark most people without their knowing it. You are old enough to understand the world, but not old enough to do anything about it. And that gap between understanding and power is where character forms. For Daniel, those years were defined by watching. He watched how money moved, not the large movements, not the newspaper economics of his father's world, but the small movements. Who could afford new shoes and who could not? Which families went quiet in November and December when heating bills climbed? Which kids at school had the specific kind of confidence that comes not from personality but from knowing that there is a net below them? He watched without judgment, at least not the kind of judgment that made him angry, more the kind that made him curious. Why were the distances between people so large? Not physical distances, the distance between the way people lived, between what was possible for some and not for others, between the ease with which some children moved through school and the effort it cost others who were equally intelligent. He thought about this a great deal. He filed what he saw. He was 13 when he read his first book about business, not a textbook, a second-hand paperback he found at the library sale, its spine cracked and its pages soft from many hands, about a man who had started a company from nothing in a garage and built it into something significant. The specifics of the company did not matter. What mattered was the map, the idea that there was a map, that the movement from nothing to something was not a mystery but a sequence of decisions, each one following from the last if you understood the logic underneath. He read it twice. He took notes in the margins in pencil because he did not want to damage the book, even though it was already damaged, already broken in the way things get when many people have needed them. He kept those notes. He transferred them to a notebook, which he kept in the same place as the coffee can, behind the loose brick. At 14, he entered a mathematics competition at the county level. He was not expected to win. Claremont was not the kind of school that sent students to county competitions expecting them to win. They sent students to fill the required number of spots. Daniel did not know this. He prepared anyway because preparation was what he did, and he won, and the county sent him to the state competition, where he came in second, and the experience of coming in second at the state level was its own kind of revelation. He had been in a room full of the best mathematical minds in Ohio, children from schools with computer labs and advanced placement courses, and teachers who had attended universities whose names everyone recognized, and he had nearly beaten them. He came home on the bus from Columbus with a second-place certificate and sat at the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time. Carol made dinner around him. George came in from work and saw the certificate and picked it up carefully, as if it were fragile, and read it all the way through even though it was only 3 sentences long. Then he set it down and said, "That is something." It was something. It was the first time Daniel understood that where you came from was not a ceiling. It was a starting point. A low one, yes, a cold one. A one with split lips and thin walls and coffee cans behind loose bricks. But a starting point. He decided, sitting at that kitchen table with the certificate between his hands, that he was going to leave. Not because he did not love his parents or Fern Street, or even Claremont in the complicated way you love things that hurt you while they shaped you, but because the engine his father had seen was pushing against the walls of what was possible here, and he was beginning to understand that the walls were real, and that staying would eventually mean becoming smaller than he was. He did not say this to anyone. He added it to the notebook behind the loose brick, in his careful penciled handwriting, as a single line, "I am going to leave." And then he closed the notebook and went to help his mother wash the dishes, and they talked about nothing in particular, and the evening was as ordinary as every other evening, and underneath the ordinary something had become fixed. The next day he went to school. He sat in his classes. He came home and did his homework. He helped with dinner. He watched the news with his father, who fell asleep in the chair as he always did, the remote control balanced on his chest. He covered him with the thin blanket kept on the arm of the couch for exactly this purpose. He went to his room. He took out the notebook. He turned to a new page. He started writing a plan. He was 17 when he got the scholarship. Not a full one, partial, which meant money still needed to come from somewhere. But the gap was smaller than it had been. And the institution offering it was a state university 2 hours from Claremont, with a business school that ranked in the top 20 in Ohio, and a financial aid office that Mrs. Aldrich had called on his behalf 3 times before anyone answered. Mrs. Aldrich, who had retired by then but had not stopped noticing, had written a letter that ran to 4 pages, single-spaced, and referenced Daniel Holt by name 12 times. He read the letter after she gave him a copy. He sat with it in the school library, the same library he had moved through systematically at 7, shelf by shelf, and read it all the way through, twice, and felt something that was too complicated to be simply called gratitude. It was gratitude, but underneath the gratitude was something structural. The recognition that people who notice you, really notice you, not for what you can do for them but simply because you are worth noticing, are rarer than anything the world calls valuable, and that what they give you cannot be counted. He told his parents that evening after dinner. Carol cried, which was the only time Daniel had ever seen her cry, though he suspected she had cried many times when he was not looking. George did not cry. George looked at the award letter with the same careful attention he had given the second-place certificate 4 years earlier, reading every word, and then he said, "You are going to go," and Daniel said yes, and that was most of the conversation. The rest was logistics, the scholarship, the loan they would take out, the part-time work Daniel was already planning, but the emotional weight of the exchange had been settled in those 2 sentences. He arrived at Whitmore State University in the second week of September with 2 bags and a box, which was all he had. His roommate, a boy named Paul from a suburb north of Cleveland, had arrived 2 days earlier and already had pictures on the wall, and a desk organizer, and a coffee maker that looked new. Paul was friendly in the uncomplicated way of someone who had never had to think about whether friendliness was safe. He offered Daniel coffee on the first morning. Daniel accepted, and they talked about nothing in particular, and something was established between them that was not exactly friendship, but was its foundation. Daniel studied economics and finance. He had chosen these because they were the language of the distances he had spent his childhood watching, and he wanted to be fluent. He wanted to understand, down to the mechanism, how wealth moved, and why it moved where it did, and what made the difference between those it moved toward and those it moved away from. He was not naive enough to think that understanding would fix anything, but he had learned, in the kitchen on Fern Street, that problems without maps are just suffering, and problems with maps are something you can work on. He was not the best student in his class. This surprised him, though perhaps it should not have. He had been exceptional in Claremont in the way that anything exceptional stands out when its surroundings are ordinary. Here the surroundings were less ordinary. There were students who had taken the courses he was now taking in high school. There were students whose parents worked in the fields they were studying, who had grown up listening to the language of finance at dinner tables that were not the kitchen table on Fern Street. Daniel worked harder than most of them. He slept less. He read more. He went to office hours for every professor, not because he was struggling, but because he had learned early that the extra access given to those who ask for it is a resource most people leave on the table. He worked 20 hours a week at a campus copying center his first year. His second year, he added a Saturday shift tutoring high school students in mathematics for a small tutoring company run out of an office on University Avenue. He was good at this. He had a way of explaining things without condescension, which people tend to be drawn to. He built a small reputation. The tutoring company's owner, a man named Alan Bates who wore the same jacket every day and had the organizational habits of someone who had learned them under stress, offered him a supervisor position in his third year, which came with a small raise and the responsibility of scheduling 4 other tutors. He organized the schedule better than Alan had been doing it. He reduced gaps, filled them with students who had been on a waiting list, and within 2 months the company's revenue had risen without any additional tutors being hired. Alan looked at the spreadsheet Daniel gave him at their monthly meeting and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn to do this?" Daniel said, "I do not know. I just looked at where the empty spaces were." Alan hired him full-time after graduation. He worked at the tutoring company for 14 months. In those 14 months, he reorganized the intake process, developed a pricing structure that Alan had never had, and wrote a business plan for expanding to 2 additional locations that Alan kept in a folder on his desk and looked at sometimes and said was interesting and did nothing with. Daniel was patient. He was 22, and he had a plan, and he understood that patience is not the same as passivity. Patience is what you do while you are building the next thing. He left the tutoring company on good terms in late autumn, 18 months after graduating, and took a junior analyst position at a financial consulting firm in Columbus. The firm was called Graybridge Partners, which sounded larger than it was. It had 11 people and occupied 2 floors of an office building on the east side of downtown that had carpet the color of old mustard and fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency Daniel could feel behind his eyes by 3 in the afternoon. He was the youngest person there by 4 years. He was also the only person there from Fern Street, which was not a thing anyone could see but which Daniel felt in the specific awareness of someone who has spent their life reading the codes of class and comfort that people carry in ways they do not realize. He wore the right clothes because he had researched the right clothes before he started. He used the right words because he had listened carefully in his 2 years of tutorials and internships to the vocabulary of the rooms he was trying to enter. He was not performing. He was translating. He was good at the work. Analysis came naturally to him, and the parts that did not come naturally, he worked until they did. His first year at Graybridge, he wrote 3 reports that his supervisor, a woman named Margaret who had been in the business for 22 years and had no patience for people who needed to be managed, described as solid. In the culture of Graybridge, solid from Margaret was the equivalent of extraordinary praise from anyone else. She was not a warm person, but she was a precise one, and her precision meant that her words carried weight. He went back to Claremont for Christmas that first year. He took the bus because he did not yet have a car. His parents were the same, which was the kind of sentence that sounds simple but is full of complicated feeling. His father's shoulders were more curved than before. His mother's hair had more gray. The house on Fern Street was the same house, the same thin walls and rolling television picture and loose brick in the bedroom that he checked when he arrived, out of habit, and found the old coffee can still there, still containing the money he had made selling chips at 13, which his parents had never touched. He sat at the kitchen table on Christmas Eve and ate his mother's cooking, and watched his father watch television, and felt the specific weight of being in 2 places at once, the place you came from and the place you are going. He loved his parents with a fierceness that had no outlet, that sat in him like a stone in his chest, heavy and permanent. He gave them money that Christmas, more than they expected, and George tried to refuse it and Carol folded it carefully into the pocket of her apron without making it a moment. And Daniel understood that this was her way of protecting his father's pride, while also accepting the practical help, and he loved her for it. Back in Columbus, he went deeper into the work. He read constantly, not just about finance and economics, but about the histories of companies, the biographies of the people who had built things, the case studies of what had succeeded and what had collapsed, and the specific turning points that separated one from the other. He noticed that in almost every significant story, there was a moment, sometimes small, sometimes dramatic, where a person had been given a clear choice between the safe path and the uncertain one, and the people who built something always took the uncertain one, not recklessly, deliberately. He was 25 when he began to form the first version of what would become his own company. Not yet. It was still only an idea, a set of questions in a new notebook. A better one than the penciled paperback from his teenage years. But the same impulse, the same systematic thinking about gaps and where they were and what could fill them. The question he kept circling back to was this: why did small businesses in communities like the one he had grown up in fail at such high rates? Not because they were badly run, always. Sometimes because they were run well, but had no access to the kind of financial advice and structured planning that larger companies bought as a matter of course. The advice that Margaret at Greybridge provided to companies with 100 employees and a boardroom. Why did no version of it exist for the man who ran a dry cleaning business on a street like Fern Street, and was good at his work, and was failing anyway, because nobody had ever shown him how a cash flow worked? This was the gap, this was the map, this was the empty space in the schedule. He started writing it down. He would come home from Greybridge at 8 in the evening and sit at his small desk in his small apartment, better than Fern Street, not so different that he had forgotten it, and he would write. He filled 2 notebooks in 6 months. He made calls. He visited small businesses in the Columbus area, not selling anything, just talking. He asked owners about their challenges. He listened to the answers more carefully than most people had listened to them before. He could tell this from how they responded, the slight widening of attention when they understood he was actually listening, the way explanations that started cautiously became more honest as the conversation continued. He was building something. He could feel it in the same way he had felt the plan solidifying at 14, sitting at the kitchen table with the second-place certificate in his hands. The same sense of something fixing itself, something that had been liquid becoming solid, something that had been movement becoming structure. He did not know yet how far the structure would go. He did not know about the gold that was coming, or the women who would offer it, or the afternoon on an ordinary day that would change the way he understood everything. He just kept writing. He kept listening. He kept the notebook open. It happened the way most important things happen, which is to say not dramatically, and not all at once, but in a series of ordinary steps that only looked significant in reverse. Daniel Holt turned 28 in February of a year, when Columbus was having the kind of winter that makes people understand why some species migrate. The heating in his apartment worked most of the time, which put him ahead of where he had been on Fern Street, and he sat at his desk every evening in a good coat, because the gap between most of the time and all of the time was felt most clearly at 10 at night, when the radiator went quiet. Greybridge Partners had grown, not dramatically, but deliberately. 3 new hires, a second office space that had better carpet, a client list that had thickened by 11 accounts over the previous 2 years. Margaret had been promoted to managing partner, which meant she was less in the weeds of the daily work, and more in meetings with people who wanted to measure things. And her absence from the weeds had created a space. Daniel had expanded into it, not aggressively. He did not step over anyone. He simply kept doing more than was required, which is a different thing. He was managing 4 accounts now. Not the largest accounts, those stayed with the senior staff, but his 4 were growing. One of them, a regional logistics company called Barrett Freight, had added 3 new clients in 6 months and attributed a significant portion of the efficiency gains to the restructuring plan Daniel had written for them. Barrett's owner, a man named Gerald who chewed on the end of his pen during meetings and laughed at his own jokes before he had finished making them, called Margaret directly to say so. Margaret told Daniel about this without particular enthusiasm, but with the specific tone that she used for things that had impressed her. He understood the coding. He also had by this point a reputation. Not the large kind, not the kind that preceded you into rooms. The small kind. The kind that travels by word of mouth in particular circles. There is a young analyst at Greybridge, not flashy, asks the right questions. His reports are worth reading. He did not cultivate this reputation deliberately. He had cultivated the work, and the reputation followed, which is the only sequence that produces a reputation worth having. The first real offer came from a firm called Carver Capital, based in Cleveland. Their recruitment contact, a composed, carefully spoken woman named Patricia who wore excellent shoes and spoke with the unhurried precision of someone who knew how much time costs, took him to lunch at a restaurant he had not been to before, and asked questions that he recognized as structured. She was building a picture. He gave her the picture he chose to give, which was not a deceptive picture but a selected one. The work he had done at Greybridge, the Barrett account, the 2 reports that had circulated beyond the firm. He did not mention the coffee can or the loose brick or the notebook from age 14. Those were his. Not secrets, but not for this conversation. Carver Capital offered him a position at twice his current salary with a quarterly performance bonus and the title of associate director. He went home and sat with the offer for 3 days before declining it. Patricia seemed genuinely surprised. He explained as simply as he could that he was building towards something of his own and that Carver Capital, excellent as it was, would not bring him closer to that. She nodded with the expression of someone who respects a decision while finding it slightly irrational. The second offer came 4 months later, from a different direction. A man named Owen Harper, who had made a considerable amount of money in commercial real estate and then gotten interested in investing in early-stage companies, had read the Barrett Freight case study that someone at Graybridge had written up for a regional business publication and wanted to speak with Daniel. Owen was in his late 50s, trim and precise, with the particular manner of someone who had stopped needing to impress anyone and therefore impressed everyone. He met Daniel at his own office, which was quiet and large, and had the kind of furniture that communicates without speaking. Owen said he was putting together a small advisory group for 3 companies he had recently invested in, all of them mid-sized businesses that needed the kind of structured financial guidance that Graybridge provided, but that Owen wanted more directly tied to the company's day-to-day operations. He said he wanted Daniel to lead the group. The compensation was significant, not only in salary but in equity, a small percentage of each company tied to performance benchmarks. Daniel sat across from Owen Harper and felt, for the first time in his professional life, the full weight of a door opening. Not just an offer, a door. The equity meant that if the companies grew, he grew with them. The independence of the structure meant he would be making decisions, not recommending them to someone who would decide. The size of it meant resources he did not currently have. He took 3 days with this one too. He called Paul, his college roommate, who was now working in healthcare administration in Cleveland, and had the measured, friendly common sense of someone who had never wanted to be rich, but had thought carefully about what he did want. Paul asked him what he was afraid of. Daniel said he was not afraid. Paul said, "Good, then there is no reason to take 3 days." Daniel laughed. He signed the agreement with Owen Harper on the 4th day. He left Graybridge with Margaret's blessing, which she gave in her characteristically precise way. She said his work had been valuable, and she hoped his next step would be worth what he was walking away from. He understood this as warmth, coming from her. The next 18 months were the hardest of his professional life. Harder than Graybridge, harder than the tutoring company, harder in the specific way of things where the stakes are real, and the margin for error is small, and everything you do is visible. He worked with the 3 companies Owen had invested in, a manufacturing business outside of Columbus, a regional chain of dental offices, and a mid-sized property management company. And the work was complex, and the timelines were tight, and there were weeks when Daniel sat at his desk until midnight, and then took the long way home, because the cold air was better than the inside of his own head when the inside of his own head would not be quiet. But the companies improved, not because of magic or luck, but because of the same thing that had always driven his outcomes. He looked at where the empty spaces were and he filled them. He saw in the manufacturing business a procurement process that was losing 20% of its potential margin through small inefficiencies that had accumulated over years without anyone ever stepping back far enough to see them. He saw in the dental offices a scheduling system that was effectively turning away 1 in 4 potential appointments through gaps that the staff did not have time to analyze. He saw in the property management company a rent collection process that was costing more to operate than anyone had calculated because it had been designed before 2 of the current software tools existed. He fixed these things. Quietly and methodically, without drama, the companies grew. Owen's investment grew. And Daniel Holt, for the first time in his life, made real money. Not extraordinary money, not yet, but enough that the gap between where he had been and where he was could be measured, and measured clearly, and he could feel the measurement in the specific way of someone who has come far enough from the starting point to see it. He moved to a better apartment. He bought a car, used, reliable. He sent his parents enough money every month to cover what had been their most consistent worries: the heating bill, the property tax, the doctor visits that George needed now and had been delaying. He did this quietly, through a bank transfer, and his mother called him when the first one arrived and said that was too much, and he said no, it is not, and she said thank you in a voice that had no more gray in it. And then, on a Tuesday in the kind of spring that Ohio produces occasionally, as an apology for its winters, the gold arrived. Her name was Charlotte, and she was the daughter of a partner in a firm that had begun circling Daniel's work with the attentiveness of an investor who has spotted something before the rest of the market has. She was 31, intelligent, well-read, with a way of entering rooms that made other people adjust. She was interested in Daniel, and she was transparent about it, in a way that was, at first, simply flattering. She began coming to events where his work was mentioned. She brought him into conversations. She was generous with her connections, which were significant, and she offered them with a lightness that made them feel like gifts rather than investments. She was not calculating in a crude way. That would be unfair. She was, more precisely, A person who had always moved through the world along paths shaped by the intersection of personal feeling and strategic advantage, and these two things had been aligned for so long that she could not have separated them if asked to. She liked Daniel. She also recognized that Daniel was going somewhere significant. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and in her experience they did not contradict each other. They spent time together over 3 months. Daniel was not entirely blind to the calculation. He had been reading people since Fern Street, and the skill did not leave him. But he was also human, and Charlotte was interesting, and the access she offered was real, and he was 29 and working too hard and perhaps more susceptible than he would have been at a different time to someone who looked at him with the particular warmth of someone who believes you are a good investment. The breaking point was a dinner, unremarkable on the outside, significant in what was said. Charlotte suggested, carefully and with apparent reasonableness, that Daniel consider bringing a specific associate from her father's firm into his next project. She phrased it as a recommendation. She phrased it as confidence in the associate's abilities. She was patient about it. She brought it up twice in the evening. Daniel drove home afterward and sat in his car outside his apartment building for a while. He was not angry. He was something closer to tired. Not of Charlotte, specifically. Of the structure of the thing. Of the way even interest and warmth, in certain circles, came with terms attached. With ledgers underneath. With a transaction waiting at the back of every gift. He thought about his mother putting the money in her apron pocket without making it a moment. He thought about what it would have been like if she had asked him for something in return. He ended things with Charlotte the following week. She was surprised and then, briefly, honest. She said she had thought they were good together. He said he thought so too in some ways. The conversation was civil and not easy, and then it was over. 3 weeks later, a different offer. Not romantic this time, financial. A group of investors who had heard his name through Owen Harper's network proposed a partnership that would have given Daniel access to capital he had not yet dreamed of, in exchange for a direction in his work that he did not want to take. A shift away from the small and mid-sized businesses he had been working with, toward larger corporate clients where the fees were higher and the work was less complicated, and the specific population he had always meant to serve would be left behind. He declined this too. His colleagues, when they heard about it, thought he was not being strategic. Owen Harper, when Daniel told him, said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You know what you want." This was not criticism. It was, Daniel understood, the closest thing to admiration that Owen Harper had ever expressed. He knew what he wanted. The gold kept coming. Different shapes of it, different offers, different rooms, different conversations where the thing being offered was real and the thing required in exchange was also real. A small or large compromise of direction. Of the particular purpose he had been carrying since he was 14, and the second-place certificate was between his hands, and the plan had first become something solid. He held to the plan, not without cost. The holding was expensive in ways that do not appear on financial statements, in nights when the uncertainty was not exciting but simply cold, in moments at events surrounded by people for whom the offers he was declining would have been answers, and he was choosing something that was not yet visible. In phone calls with Paul, who always listened and always said what needed to be said, which was usually, "You know what you want." He did. He was building something. The gold was not the thing he was building. The gold was what you were given, when people thought they understood your price. They had not yet offered the thing that was worth keeping. It was coming from an entirely different direction. It was coming on an ordinary afternoon, from a woman with nothing to give except what she had. The afternoon began the way most significant afternoons begin, which is to say it did not announce itself at all. Daniel had a meeting in the Westland district of Columbus, a neighborhood that sat on the edge of what realtors call transitional, which is a word that means changing and also means different things depending on which direction the change is traveling. Some of the streets here had been renewed, others were waiting. The buildings were a mix of old and rebuilt, and the sidewalks were uneven in the specific way of places where the infrastructure budget runs out before the work is finished. The meeting was with a man named Carl who ran a small auto repair shop and had been referred to Daniel through a community business development center that Daniel had been quietly connected to for 2 years. Carl was 53, with grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing fully removed, and a shop that had been operating for 18 years and was losing ground to a chain garage that had opened 4 blocks away the previous spring. He was not unintelligent, far from it. He simply did not have the language or the framework to understand what was happening to his numbers. Only that the numbers were heading in a direction he had not chosen. The meeting ran long. Carl was the kind of person who spoke in circles, not because he was unfocused, but because the thing he was trying to say was complicated, and he was still finding the edges of it. And Daniel had learned, since the tutoring, since the small businesses in the early days of his own work, that the most useful thing you could do for a person like Carl was give them the time to find the edges without cutting them off. He sat with it. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He wrote things down in the notebook he still carried everywhere, the newest in a long series of notebooks, though the handwriting had not changed much since 14. He left Carl's shop at 3:45. The meeting had gone well in the sense that it had gone honestly, which Daniel had learned was the only useful kind of good. Carl was not going to be an easy case. The chain garage had advantages that were structural: buying power, advertising budget, brand recognition, and Carl's advantages were human ones. 18 years of relationships with people in this neighborhood, knowledge of vehicles that could not be systematically replicated, a quality of attention that chains could not train into staff because it came from caring about the particular customer in the particular car. These were real advantages. They needed to be made legible, turned into strategy rather than simply felt. Daniel was thinking about this as he walked. He had parked 3 blocks from the shop because the nearest lot had been full, and he had walked over. The afternoon light was the kind that comes in October in Ohio, low and golden and making everything look more significant than it is. He was hungry. He had not eaten since breakfast, which was a common occurrence when he was deep in work, and the work was interesting enough to crowd out the ordinary signals of the body. There was a small church at the corner of Millbridge and Vernon, not large, the kind of church that has been in a neighborhood for 60 or 70 years, and has outlasted 3 or 4 waves of change in the surrounding blocks and carries that survival in its brickwork. It had steps going up to the main doors, wide stone steps, and on one of the middle steps a folding table had been set up with a hand-lettered sign that said, "Community Lunch. Free. Come in or take and go." Daniel glanced at it as he passed. Then he stopped. He was hungry. That was the simple and complete reason. He turned back and walked up to the table. The woman behind the table was not young. She was, he estimated, somewhere in her late 60s, though the kind of late 60s that carries its years lightly. A quality less of physical preservation than of interior steadiness, the kind that comes from a person who has settled, over decades, into their own skin. She had white hair pulled back simply, and glasses with dark frames, and a coat that had been very good at some point, and was now simply warm. She was talking to an older man who was taking a bowl of soup and nodding. She was not just serving. She was present in the way of someone for whom presence is the point. She looked up when Daniel approached. She looked at him the way people look when they are actually looking, not performing a look. She said, "Are you hungry?" He said yes. He said it without self-consciousness, which surprised him slightly because he had spent a decade training himself to present a version of himself that did not include hunger. She reached under the table and brought out a cloth napkin wrapped around something and handed it to him. Then she reached back to the bread basket on the table and took out a piece of bread. A good piece, thick, fresh, the kind you could smell even before you took it, and she set it on top of the napkin. She said, "That is all I have left for takeaway, but it is enough." He stood with the cloth napkin in one hand and the bread in the other. The bread was warm. He looked at her. She was already looking back at the older man, already back in a different conversation, not because she had dismissed Daniel, but because she operated without the pause of self-congratulation that generosity sometimes inserts between the act and the continuation of ordinary life. She had given him bread because he was hungry. The transaction was complete. She moved on. He had not introduced himself. She had not asked. He said thank you. She said, "Take care." He walked down the steps and continued down Millbridge Avenue toward where his car was parked. He ate the bread as he walked. It was very good bread. Inside the cloth napkin was a small container of soup, still warm, and 2 crackers. He stood next to his car and finished the soup and the crackers and folded the cloth napkin carefully. He held the folded napkin for a moment. He stood there in the October light and something happened inside him that was not a dramatic thing, not a collapse or a revelation or anything that would look significant from the outside. It was quieter than that. It was the particular sensation of understanding something you already knew but had never felt at the right moment. The way a mathematical proof can be understood in the head for months, and then one afternoon you read it again, and it lands in the chest as well, and you think, yes, now I understand it. He had been receiving things for 4 years, not just Charlotte and the investors, those were the obvious ones, but all of it. The dinners, the events, the connections offered, the deals proposed, the rooms opened. All of it had weight. All of it had terms. All of it, however generously offered, had the quality of an exchange. Here is this thing, and here is what it expects of you. The terms were sometimes spoken, and sometimes unspoken. They were always present. He had felt them every time and had sometimes accepted the thing and sometimes declined it, but he had always felt the terms first and the gift second. She had given him bread because he was hungry and asked for nothing and moved on. There were no terms. There was no ledger. There was not even, as far as he could tell, the particular warmth that people sometimes perform when they want to be known as the kind of person who gives things. She was not performing. She was simply a woman who had bread and encountered a hungry person and gave the bread. It was the smallest possible version of generosity. It was also the purest version he had encountered in 4 years of living in rooms where generosity was currency. He put the folded napkin in his coat pocket. He got in his car. He sat with the engine off for a while. He was not thinking about Charlotte, or the investors, or the company he was building. He was thinking about his mother, folding money into her apron pocket without making it a moment. He was thinking about his father putting his hands flat on the kitchen table to check that solid things still existed. He was thinking about Mrs. Aldrich and the extra problems she slid across his desk and the 4-page letter she wrote when she had been retired for 3 years and had no obligation left to anyone. He was thinking about what it meant to give something because the person in front of you needs it, with no additional clause. He started the car. He drove home. He had already been building something. He had known what it was, but something about the weight and direction of it had just become clearer, the way a path through fog becomes clearer not when the fog lifts, but when you realize you have been walking in the right direction all along. He parked the car and went inside. He did not sit down immediately. He stood in the middle of his apartment for a moment, coat still on, the folded napkin still in his pocket, and he looked at his desk and the whiteboard and the notebooks stacked in their particular order on the shelf. Everything he had built toward was still there, the same as it had been that morning, the same as it had been the previous year and the year before that. Nothing had changed in the room. Everything was different, not in a way he could explain to someone else that evening, or the next day, not in a way that would appear in the notebooks as a new entry, or in the whiteboard as a changed framework. The framework was the same, the notebooks were the same, the plan was the same. He was different. Or more precisely, he was more completely himself. The version of him that had been moving in a direction since 14 was still moving in the same direction, but now he understood, in a way that had not been available to him before, what the direction felt like from the destination. He had arrived at the destination in a moment, held it in his hand, felt its warmth. And now he was going back to the road. He took his coat off. He put the cloth napkin on the desk beside the notebooks. He sat down. He opened the notebook to the next blank page. He wrote the date. He wrote, "She gave me bread because I was hungry, no other reason." He looked at those words for a while. Then he wrote, "That is what the whole thing is supposed to feel like." He put the pen down. He did not write anything else that evening. He made dinner. He ate. He went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in several weeks, and he slept without difficulty. And in the morning the cloth napkin was still on the desk beside the notebooks, and the notebooks were still stacked in their order, and the whiteboard was still the same whiteboard, and he made coffee and sat at his desk and picked up the pen and opened the notebook and began the day's work. The napkin stayed on his desk for 11 years. He never explained it to anyone who noticed it. He was not the same after the bread, not in any dramatic way that other people could see. He was still Daniel Holt, still the man who went to meetings with car shop owners and sat with their numbers until the shape of the problem revealed itself, still the man who came home to his apartment and opened the notebook and wrote in pencil as he always had. Still the man who sent money to Fern Street on the 1st of every month and took calls from Paul on Sunday evenings and declined dinner invitations from people whose dinner invitations contained terms in the fine print. But he was aware of something that he had not been aware of before. Not a new awareness, more the sharpening of something that had been blurry, like adjusting the focus on a lens that had been close enough for most purposes but now needed to be precise. He began to pay different attention to the motivations behind the things people did for him. He had always paid attention to this. It was a skill developed on Fern Street, refined through years of reading rooms he had not grown up in. But previously he had paid this attention with a kind of practical defensiveness, noting the terms so he could negotiate them, understanding the ledger so he could decide whether the transaction was worth it. He had not paid attention to its absence. He had not looked, specifically, for the people who gave without the ledger. When he started looking, he found them. Not many, but more than he had expected. There was a man in the community business center where he had been connected to Carl's case, a volunteer coordinator named Eugene, 60-something, retired from a career in construction management, who spent 2 afternoons a week helping small business owners in the Westland district read their finances. Eugene made no money from this. He received no credit beyond a small mention in the center's quarterly newsletter, which had a circulation of perhaps 200. He brought his own coffee in a thermos, and he sat with people at plastic tables, and he explained cash flow statements with the patience of someone who had decided that this was what his afternoons were for now, and that was sufficient reason. Daniel started volunteering at the center on Wednesday afternoons. He did not do this to be known as someone who volunteered at the center. He did it because he had realized that the thing he was building, the company that lived in the notebooks, the one that was still mostly idea and framework but becoming more solid every month, needed to be rooted in this. Not as a marketing strategy, as an anchor. If he lost his way, if the gold got louder and the original direction got quieter, he needed something that would pull him back. Eugene noticed Daniel after the second Wednesday. He came over during the coffee break between clients and said, "You are not a typical volunteer." Daniel said he was not sure what a typical volunteer looked like. Eugene said, "They give advice. You listen first." Daniel said he had learned that listening was where the actual information lived. Eugene nodded as if this were something he had known for a long time, and was pleased to hear confirmed. They had coffee. They talked for 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes Daniel understood that Eugene was the kind of person who makes things possible, without ever appearing on the list of people who made things possible. He had been doing this work for 6 years. He had helped, he said without bragging, probably 40 businesses stay open that would otherwise have closed. He named none of them. He did not have a business card. He had a thermos and a plastic chair, and the patience of someone who had decided, at some point, what mattered. Daniel went home that evening and opened his notebook to a new page. He had started titling his pages recently, not with formal headers but with questions. The question he wrote that evening was, what does it mean to build something that earns its place? He wrote for 2 hours. Not about the company directly, about what he wanted the company to feel like from the inside. Not the brand, not the product, not the market positioning, but the interior quality of it. The thing that Eugene did at the plastic tables with his thermos. The thing that Mrs. Aldrich did with the extra problems she slid across desks. The thing that the woman on the church steps did when she handed him bread without asking his name. He wanted to build something that felt like that, not a non-profit. He had thought about this carefully, and concluded that he was not built for it in the structural sense. His mind worked in markets, in efficiencies, in gaps and how to fill them, and he believed genuinely that a well-run business did as much good as a charity, and sometimes more, because it was sustainable in ways that charity, without the underlying economic logic, often was not. He wanted to build a business. He just wanted it to be built on a different logic than the one that had been offered to him. The company he was forming was called, in the notebooks, simply The Gap Work. He had not found the right name yet. The premise was the one he had been circling since graduate school. Small and mid-sized businesses in underserved communities had the same fundamental financial challenges as larger companies, but none of the access to the expertise required to address them. A chain garage could absorb the competition from a new competitor, because it had a corporate team that had planned for exactly that scenario. Carl could not, because Carl was running the shop and doing the ordering and managing 2 mechanics and answering the phone himself, and the thing he needed, someone to sit with his numbers and show him what they meant and help him make a plan, was available in the market but not at the price point Carl could reach. Daniel was going to bridge that, not as charity, as a structured, sustainable model. A small team of analysts, including some people being paid, and some people doing what Eugene did at the center, partnered with businesses at a cost that was real, but that reflected the actual circumstances of the businesses being served. Funded partly through fees, partly through the impact investment model that Owen Harper had pointed him toward, partly through municipal grants for economic development that existed but went unclaimed, because the grant writing was its own specialized skill that small business owners did not have. He talked to Owen Harper about it in a meeting that was supposed to last 40 minutes and ran to almost 2 hours. Owen listened the way he always listened, with the complete attention of someone for whom listening is a learned art. And then he asked questions for 30 minutes, pointed questions, the kind that take the foundations of an idea and stress test them one by one. Daniel answered each one. Some he had already answered in the notebook, some he had not fully worked through and said so, which Owen seemed to respect. At the end, Owen said, "The model works if you can solve the unit economics in the first 3 years." Daniel said he knew. Owen said, "You will need a team." Daniel said he had names. Owen said, "The capital question." Daniel said he had 3 conversations pending. Owen picked up his pen and set it down. He said, "I want to be part of this." Daniel said, "I know." It was not arrogance. He had known since the first meeting with Owen that the man was looking for something that fit a very specific shape in his investment thinking, and that what Daniel was building fit it. He had waited for Owen to see it himself, because offers accepted before the other person has arrived at them on their own terms are fragile. He had waited. Owen had arrived. He moved out of his apartment that spring into a 2-bedroom he rented partly as a home and partly as an office. The second bedroom had a desk and 2 chairs and a whiteboard he had carried up 3 flights of stairs by himself and mounted with brackets he bought at the hardware store on 5th Street. He worked at this desk every morning from 5:30 to 8, which was when the first of what would become his team arrived. His first hire was a woman named Diane, 24, a recent graduate in accounting who had grown up in a neighborhood not entirely unlike Fern Street, in a different city, and who had the specific quality of someone who has learned that competence is not enough, and that making yourself useful to others is what keeps the doors open. She was precise, unsentimental, and had a dry sense of humor that surfaced in moments of pressure, which Daniel understood immediately as a survival skill. He hired her in the 2nd month. His second hire was Marcus, 30, who had been working at a community bank in the lending department and had a gift for explaining complex financial concepts to people who had not encountered them before, which was the same gift Daniel had cultivated in the tutoring days but trained differently, with more patience and less framework. Marcus spoke in examples. He could make interest rate compounding feel like a story about something real. Daniel had seen him explain a loan structure to a small business owner in 12 minutes in a way that would have taken the Graybridge approach 2 hours and 3 presentations. With Diane and Marcus, and with Owen's initial capital, and with a name, they settled on Bridgework Financial, which was not glamorous but was accurate. Daniel opened a real office in the first week of November, a year and a half after the afternoon on the church steps. The office was small. It was on the 2nd floor of a building on the east side of Columbus that was half occupied by a small law firm and half by a company that sold custom signage. The elevator worked sometimes, the coffee maker in the break room was second-hand, the carpet was a more optimistic color than Graybridge's old mustard but not dramatically more expensive. He sat at his desk on the first morning in the actual office, not the home office, the real one, and looked at the whiteboard where he had transferred the framework from the bedroom wall and the notebooks, the service model, the pricing tiers, the grant framework, the partnership structure with the community centers, the names of the first 8 potential client businesses. He thought about the woman at the church steps. He had not thought about her every day. He was not the kind of person who collected moments and returned to them compulsively, but he thought about her in the specific moments when the direction of things needed checking, when someone offered something that had gold in it, when the line between what he was building and what he was being offered to build instead needed to be seen clearly. She had not done anything large. She had handed him bread because he was hungry and she had bread to give. That was the complete inventory of what had happened. What it had given him was not a lesson. He did not need a lesson. He was a man who had been building towards something since 14. What it had given him was the clearest possible image of what that something felt like from the receiving end, so that he could know, not intellectually but in the body, in the chest, whether the thing he was building carried that quality or whether it had drifted. He picked up his pen. He turned to a new page in the notebook. He wrote the date. He wrote, "First day." He began. The woman's name was Helen Park, and she had been standing behind folding tables in church lots and community centers, and the side entrances of school gymnasiums for 31 years. She did not think of this as extraordinary. She would have been genuinely puzzled by anyone who did. She thought of it the way other people think of the things they have simply always done, with the mild puzzlement of trying to explain the unremarkable. She had been raised in a house where feeding people was as natural as breathing. Her mother had done it, her grandmother before that. It was not a philosophy. It was the language her family spoke. She had grown up in a small Ohio town called Hendricks, which had 1 main street and 2 churches and a factory that employed most of the men, including her father, a quiet man named Harold who worked the early shift and was home by 3 every afternoon, and spent the remaining hours of daylight in the garden. The garden was his form of something, prayer maybe, or meditation, or simply the satisfaction of making things grow in ground that did not always cooperate. Helen had helped him in it from the time she could hold a trowel. She had learned early that the patience required to tend growing things is the same patience required for most of the useful work in life. Her mother, whose name was Grace, and who was by most accounts from those who remembered her, exactly that, had run the church kitchen with the same quiet authority with which she ran everything else in her domain, not loudly, not with the visible management style of someone who needs to be seen managing, but with the particular presence of someone who has organized chaos into order so many times that the chaos no longer bothers to put up a fight. Grace cooked for funerals and weddings and the sick and the newly arrived, and the chronically lonely, with equal attention, which is the thing about her that Helen remembered most clearly. Equal attention, not the performance of equal attention, the actual thing. Helen was the middle child of 3. Her older brother, William, had become an engineer in Cincinnati. Her younger sister Patty had moved to Nashville in her 20s to follow a man who turned out to be less than she deserved and had stayed anyway, not for him. She had eventually and sensibly left him, but because she had built a life there that fit her. Helen had stayed in Ohio. She had not stayed from a lack of ambition or a shortage of options. She had stayed because the things she wanted were in Ohio, or at least the version of them she had chosen was. She had worked for 15 years as a nursing assistant at the Riverside Medical Center in Columbus. This was the work that nobody frames on the wall, the work that the medical system could not function without, and that is paid accordingly, which is to say not enough, and which requires a combination of physical endurance and emotional steadiness that is harder to develop than any clinical skill, and goes almost entirely unremarked. She had been good at it, not in the sense of technical efficiency, though she was technically efficient, but in the sense that the patients she worked with knew they were being seen. The very old who were frightened knew it. The dying, who were sometimes angry about dying, knew it. The young patients who were confused by being in a body that was failing them, knew it. She had left Riverside at 55 not because she had been asked to, but because her knees had decided, in the way of bodies that have done physical work for decades, that the terms of the arrangement needed revision. She was not bitter about this either. She was practical. She had a small pension, manageable expenses, and an amount of time that she promptly allocated to the things she had not had enough time for when she was working full shifts. The church kitchen was one of these things. She had been volunteering there for years in the gaps, weekends, occasional evenings, and when she had the time she brought her whole attention to it. She organized the food donations with the same invisible authority her mother had brought to the church kitchen in Hendricks. She cooked large quantities of things that kept well and could be eaten standing or sitting, outside on steps or inside at tables, by people whose circumstances were varied, and whose dignity was not up for negotiation in Helen's kitchen. She did not know Daniel Holt. On the afternoon of his visit to the table on the church steps, she had been there since 11. It was a Tuesday, which was a shorter distribution day. Tuesdays the center stayed open until 4, not 6. Because Tuesday volunteers were harder to get, and Helen had learned not to force the schedule past what the volunteers could sustain, or they stopped coming. She had brought soup in a large pot, which she transported in her car in the heavy carrier that lived permanently in her trunk for this purpose, and bread from the bakery on Crown Street that donated the day-old loaves, and the crackers and the apples and the cartons of juice that the grocery on Millbridge let her take each Tuesday. By 3:15 she was nearly out. The bread basket had 3 pieces left. The soup pot had enough for maybe 4 portions. The crackers and juice were finished. She was not worried about running out. Running out was information, not failure. It meant she needed to start earlier next time, or call the grocery the day before to see if they had more. She filed it in the same mental notebook where she kept all operational information about the kitchen work, which was a very organized notebook even if it only existed in her head. The man who came up the steps at 3:45 was not someone she recognized. He was tall, well-dressed in the quiet way of someone who wore good clothes without making them the point, and he had the look of someone who had been working and was hungry and had walked into the afternoon unsure of the next several steps. She recognized this look. It was not a class look or a status look. It was the look of someone who is inside their own mind and has briefly run low on the fuel that thinking requires. She asked if he was hungry. He said yes. She gave him what she had, the cloth napkin with the soup container and crackers she had set aside for takeaway, and the last good piece of bread. She said what she said. That was all she had. But it was enough. She meant both halves of that sentence. She had always believed that enough was a real thing, not a consolation for less than you wanted. Enough was the thing that met the need. The need in front of her was a man who was hungry. What she had was bread and soup and crackers. These things were equal to that need. That was what enough meant. She returned to the older man she had been talking to. He was a regular, a retired postal worker named Pete who came every Tuesday not entirely for the food but partly for the conversation, and Helen understood this and made sure the conversation was always available. Pete was talking about his grandchildren, who lived in Pittsburgh and visited 3 times a year, which Pete found both wonderful and insufficient. Helen listened. She said the things you say when you are actually listening, which are mostly small words in the right places. After Pete left, she began to break down the table. She folded the cloth over the empty bread basket. She carried the soup pot back to the carrier in her trunk. She folded the table and carried it inside, and set it against the wall in the room behind the main hall where the tables were stored. And she carried the empty boxes and the folded cloths to the recycling, and the laundry as appropriate, and she drove home. She lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side that she had occupied for 11 years. It was not large. It was organized in the way of someone who has thought about how they want to live, and arranged things accordingly. She had plants in the windows, which she watered on Thursdays. She had a reading chair near the lamp in the corner of the living room that had a small table beside it for the cup of tea she made every evening. She had a kitchen that smelled of the specific herbs she kept fresh in small pots on the sill. She made dinner. She ate. She read for an hour in the reading chair. She called her sister Patty, who was in Nashville, and they talked for 40 minutes about ordinary things. Patty's garden, Helen's knees, a film they had both watched separately, their brother William's retirement party coming up in the spring. Helen said she would come. Patty said good, she was glad. She went to bed at 10:30. She slept without difficulty. She did not think about the man with the bread, not because the encounter had been insignificant, but because significance, in Helen's experience, was not something you chose to register afterward. You gave what you had. The encounter completed itself. You moved on, not dismissively, but because moving on was what allowed you to be present for the next thing. She had learned this from her mother, who had learned it from her mother, who had presumably learned it from someone before her, and it had become the rhythm of her life without ever becoming a philosophy. She did not have theories about generosity. She simply had practice. What she did not know, could not know, had no way of knowing, was that the man who had come up the steps at 3:15 was the same man who, over the next 3 years, would structure the grant application that allowed the Westland Community Business Center to expand its operations. The same man who had Eugene's volunteer program formalized and funded. The same man who eventually provided the kind of professional financial structure to the church's broader community programs that allowed them to extend their Tuesday and Thursday distributions to every weekday. She would benefit from his work, in the practical sense that the programs she was part of would have more resources, more coordination, more sustainability. She would not know this was connected to the afternoon on the steps. She would have been pleased to know it, not for her own sake, but because she cared about those programs and was glad when they grew. But she would not have connected it to herself, because she did not think in those terms. She had given bread. Things that were supposed to grow, grew. She did not need to be the reason. This is the quality that Daniel had recognized, standing at the bottom of the church steps with the warm bread in his hand. Not the generosity. He had encountered generosity before. The absence of the need to be the reason. The freedom of an act from the weight of its own significance. The quality that his mother had when she folded money into her apron pocket. The quality that Mrs. Aldrich had when she slid problems across his desk without explanation. The quality that Eugene had at the plastic tables with his thermos. He had been searching for a word for this quality for years without finding it. He had been building toward it without being able to name it. Standing at the bottom of those steps, bread in hand, he understood that the word did not matter. The quality itself was what he was after. The word was decoration. The thing was the thing. And the thing, it turned out, was the foundation of everything he was building. Had always been. He had just needed to see it, briefly and unexpectedly, in its simplest possible form. He had needed the bread. Helen woke the next morning and watered her plants even though it was not Thursday, because one of them looked like it needed it, and she stood at the window with the watering can and looked at the street below and the sky above and the particular quality of early light on the buildings, and felt the ordinary satisfaction of a morning that was starting correctly. She made tea. She sat in her reading chair. She opened the book she had been reading and found her place. Outside, the city was beginning its day. Buses were passing. A child on the sidewalk below was walking with a backpack that was slightly too large for him, and his mother was walking behind him, and from the window they looked like a small parade of two, determined and ordinary, and moving forward. Helen watched them until they were out of sight. Then she went back to her book. She had things to do today. The grocery on Millbridge needed a call about Tuesday. She wanted to look at the schedule for the kitchen and see whether the Thursday distribution could use another volunteer, since Pete had mentioned his neighbor might be interested. She had a doctor appointment in the afternoon for her knees, which were giving her more trouble than she had told anyone, because the kitchen work was more important, and she saw no reason to make her knees a conversation. Her life was organized around the things that mattered to her. This had not always been easy. There had been years when the organizing had required sacrifice, when the things that mattered most were the things for which no one paid her, and which existed alongside the things for which she was paid, and which she was also committed to doing well. She had learned, over decades, how to hold both, not without cost, but without complaint. She was not someone who cataloged her own goodness. It would have bored her. She was practical, and the work was practical, and the satisfactions it offered were practical. The table that got cleared, the people who ate, the kitchen that ran, the Tuesday that happened because she made it happen. These were enough, more than enough. She did not know that in an office on the east side of Columbus, on a desk covered with notebooks and a whiteboard, and a small folded cloth napkin that nobody had explained, a man was building something because of an afternoon she had already entirely forgotten. She would have been glad, had she known. She also would have said, "I only gave him bread, he did the rest." And she would have been right. And she would have meant it, fully and without false modesty, because she understood, in the way that some people understand things they have never put into words, that the giving and the doing are two different acts, and the glory of each belongs to the person who performed it. She had given bread. He had done the rest. Those were two separate and complete things, and she would have wanted it understood that way. Diane arrived 20 minutes early on the first actual morning of business. She had coffee in a paper cup from the place on the corner, and she set it on Daniel's desk without comment, which was exactly the kind of thing Diane did. Not gestures of warmth but gestures of practicality, delivered with such consistency that over time they amounted to warmth. Marcus arrived exactly on time, which was also exactly like Marcus. He stood in the doorway of the office for a moment and looked around with the expression of someone doing an honest assessment and then said, "It is a real place." Daniel said yes. Marcus said, "Good." He went to his desk and turned on his computer. They had 8 potential clients in the pipeline. Not confirmed clients. Potential, meaning Daniel had had preliminary conversations with all 8 businesses, and all 8 had expressed genuine interest, which in the early stage of any business translates to approximately 4 who will actually sign, which Daniel had already adjusted for in the projections he had given Owen. Carl from the auto repair shop was number 1 on the list. They had continued talking through the summer and autumn while Daniel was building the structure, and Carl had stayed interested in a way that some clients do when they sense the person they are talking to understands what they are dealing with. There was also a woman named Rita who ran a catering business out of a commercial kitchen she rented by the hour, a man named Dennis who owned 2 dry cleaning locations on the east side, a family bakery in its second generation that had been losing margin to a new supermarket on the same block, and 4 others in various industries and stages of challenge. Daniel called Carl that morning. He told him that Bridgework Financial was open and they were ready to begin the engagement. Carl made a sound that was part laugh and part relief and said, "Well, it is about time." Daniel said he knew. Carl said, "You know what my accountant told me last month? He told me to raise my prices and stop worrying." Daniel said that was not useful advice. Carl said, "That is the kindest way anyone has put it." He brought Diane to the first Carl meeting and had her take the lead on the financial review. He sat to the side and watched and noted. It was one of his management principles, developed in the early days of the home office. Hire people who can do the work better than you can in specific areas, and then let them, which requires the specific skill of not talking when you have the urge to talk. Diane was better than Daniel at the detailed line-by-line analysis, and she was faster. And when she found the procurement inefficiency, similar in structure to what he had found at the manufacturing company but different in its particulars, she walked Carl through it in a way that was clear, without being condescending, which was a skill that looked simple from the outside, and was not. Carl said afterward, on the way out of the shop, "She is good." Daniel said yes. Carl said, "How did you find her?" Daniel said she found him, more or less, which was true. Diane had emailed him after reading a piece he had contributed to a regional business journal, 3 sentences at the end that described what he was building. Carl said, "Those 3 sentences worked." Daniel said he hoped so. The first 6 months were not smooth. They never are, which is a thing everyone says, and which remains true regardless of how many times it is said. The first challenge was time. 3 people with 8 clients, even 8 clients who were not large, meant that the hours were long in the specific way of early-stage work, where the thing not yet working costs time, and the thing trying to work also costs time, and both of these are happening simultaneously. The second challenge was money. The fees from the first clients were real but modest, which was by design but which meant the margin for error in expenses was thin. The third challenge was credibility. Several businesses that Daniel had expected to convert from potential to confirmed did not convert because they were not yet sure that a small new firm, however well-intentioned, was a safer bet than doing nothing, and doing nothing has the specific appeal of familiarity. He handled these challenges with the same systematic patience he had applied to everything since the notebooks and the coffee can. He did not panic. He adjusted. When a potential client did not convert, he asked why. Not with the urgency of a salesperson, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who wants to understand the thing correctly. The answers were usually useful. He refined the approach. He had Diane develop a clearer presentation of the economic case. He had Marcus go back to the 3 that seemed closest to converting, and spend more time on the actual listening part. the part where the client got to describe what they were afraid of rather than what they wanted. 2 of those 3 converted within 2 months. By the end of the first year, Bridgework Financial had 11 paying clients, a 4th team member, a woman named Karen who had come from a municipal grants office and could write grant applications the way other people write grocery lists, quickly and without drama, and a small surplus in the accounts that Owen Harper looked at with the controlled enthusiasm of someone who had been right about a bet and was not going to be graceless about it. Owen was on Daniel's advisory board by now, which meant they met quarterly, and Owen asked hard questions, and Daniel answered them, or said he did not have the answer yet, and explained what he was doing to get it. Owen had also done something unexpected. He had told 2 other investors about Bridgework in terms that were not specifically promotional but were, in the unmistakable vocabulary of Owen Harper, the equivalent of a strong endorsement. Both investors had reached out. Daniel met with both of them. He was careful in these conversations in a way that had become instinctive. He was clear about what Bridgework was, clear about what it was not, and clear about the terms on which additional capital would be welcome. He had learned, in the Charlotte period and in the investment offers that followed it, that the first conversation about money is the place where the terms of everything that follows are set, and that terms accepted under the pressure of need are almost always regretted. He was not under pressure of need. He was under pressure of ambition, which is a different thing. Ambition can be patient. He was patient. He accepted a small additional investment from one of the 2, a man named Richard who had made his money in logistics and had the specific curiosity of someone who had built one kind of thing and was interested in the building of different kinds of things. Richard asked good questions. He did not suggest changes to the model. He seemed to understand, without being told, that the model was not a starting point to be negotiated from but a core to be maintained. He told Daniel, at the end of their first conversation, that he had heard about Bridgework from Owen Harper, and that Owen had said something that Richard wanted to repeat. Richard said, "Owen told me you know what you want." Richard said he had been investing in companies for 19 years, and that was rarer than it sounded. Daniel said, "I have always known what I wanted. I just needed to build the thing that goes with it." Richard said, "What did you want?" Daniel thought about this for a while. He was sitting in his apartment, a better one now, the 3rd he had lived in since leaving Fern Street, in a building that worked all the time, heating and elevator and all of it. He had a coffee cup in his hand. Through the window, the Columbus skyline was doing the thing it did in autumn, when the light went low and the buildings held the gold. He said, "I wanted to build something that gave people what they needed without charging them something they should not have to pay." Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is an unusual business model." Daniel said, "It works if you are serious about it." Richard said, "I believe you." He meant it. Daniel could tell. Not everyone who said they believed you meant it, but Richard did, in the specific way of someone who has been watching long enough to distinguish between conviction and performance. They shook hands. Daniel went back to his office and sat at his desk and opened his notebook. He did not write anything immediately. He just sat for a moment with the notebook open and the pen in his hand, and the whiteboard in front of him, and the sound of Diane's keyboard from the next room, and Marcus's voice on the phone somewhere in the building. He thought about the woman at the church steps. He thought about the bread. He had never gone back to find her. This was not avoidance. He had considered it. More than once in the first year. He had driven through the Westland district and past the corner of Millbridge and Vernon, and looked at the church steps and thought about stopping. But he had not stopped, and he had eventually understood why. She had not done what she did in order to be found and thanked. She had done what she did because it was what the moment required. Finding her and thanking her would be converting the thing into a transaction, making it about him, making it about what he felt and what he owed. That was exactly the thing the act had been free of. He would not change it by trying to repay it. He would, instead, do the thing that the act had oriented him toward. He would build something that ran on the same logic. He would make sure that the people in his building, in his company, in the ecosystem of relationships that Bridgework was constructing, that they experienced, in the way they were treated, and the way they were served, and the way their particular difficulties were met, something that had the same quality. He would make sure the bread was always free of terms. He picked up his pen. He turned to a new page. He wrote, Year 2. The second year was busier and harder in different ways than the first, and better in most of the ways that mattered. The team grew by 2 more, Oliver, who had spent years in social work and brought a quality of attention to the intake conversations that Daniel recognized immediately as irreplaceable, and Lucy, who had grown up inside her family's restaurant and read financial statements the way most people read the newspaper, quickly and with the specific attention of someone who already knows the context in which the numbers live. These two changed the texture of the company, not the structure. The structure was what Daniel had built. The texture is what people bring when they are the right people, and Oliver and Lucy were the right people. The company's intake conversations became more honest. The first meetings with new clients became less formal and more useful. The time from first contact to actionable plan shortened because less time was needed at the beginning to establish the kind of trust that allowed honest information to flow. Carl noticed this when Diane brought Lucy in for a follow-up on the procurement work. He said afterward, "That is a different kind of meeting than we used to have." Daniel said he knew. Carl said, "She understood the shop before she said anything." Daniel said that was Lucy. Carl said, "How did you build a company full of people like that?" Daniel said he had looked for people who listened before they advised. Carl said, "You must have had a good example." Daniel said he had more than one. The second year ended with 23 clients. Not all of them were successes in the way that success is usually measured. 2 businesses failed despite the Bridgework engagement, for reasons that were structural in the way that no amount of financial advice can entirely address when the market has shifted too far in a direction that cannot be reversed quickly enough. Daniel wrote about these in his notebook without comfort, because false comfort is its own form of dishonesty. He wrote, "The work does not fix everything. It fixes what can be fixed. That is worth doing." He still believed it was worth doing. He still believed it every morning when he sat at the desk with the whiteboard and the notebooks and the cloth napkin that nobody explained. He still believed it when the gold came back in new shapes, as it periodically did, because his name had grown to the size where the people with gold found it, and brought it to him in the reasonable expectation that a man of his growing reputation would eventually accept something. He was still declining. He was still building. The building was not finished. It would not be finished for a long time, if ever. Good buildings are not finished. They are used and maintained and improved and lived in, and the living changes them, and they are better for the change while remaining themselves. That was what he was making. Something that could be lived in. Something that could sustain the living without losing its shape. He picked up his pen. He turned to a new page. He wrote the date. He wrote, "This is the work." It was, by the time Daniel Holt was 36, people in Columbus who worked in the overlap between finance and community development knew his name. Not widely, not the kind of name that appears in national profiles or on lists that journalists compile annually. The smaller kind. The kind that is specific and meaningful. If you were a small business owner in a certain kind of neighborhood in Columbus, or a community development director, or a grants officer at a foundation that worked in economic equity, you had heard of Bridgework Financial, and you had heard of Daniel Holt, and what you had heard was consistent. What you had heard was, they are the ones who show up, not metaphorically, literally. Daniel Holt and his team showed up to client meetings at the client's location rather than requiring the client to come to them, which was partly practical. The client's books and operations were where the client was, and partly philosophical. Going to where the person is, rather than requiring them to come to where you are, is a statement about who is doing whom a favor. What you had heard was, they listen before they advise. This sounds obvious. In practice, most financial consulting operates on a model where the expertise arrives with preformed categories and the client's situation is interpreted through them, which works for standard situations and misses the situations that are non-standard, which are most small businesses because most small businesses are the specific invention of the specific person running them, shaped by that person's life and history and particular way of solving problems. Bridgeworks' model started with the non-standard and worked backward to the general, which is harder and slower and more accurate. What you had heard was, they are not trying to make you dependent on them. This one took longer to understand when people first heard it. The dominant model in financial consulting, the model that makes financial consulting a good business, is the model of ongoing dependency. The client needs you perpetually because the expertise is yours and not theirs, and each billing cycle produces more value. Bridgeworks' model was different. Part of every engagement was transferring knowledge to the client, building the client's capacity to understand their own numbers, so that at a certain point the client could do more of the work themselves, and the engagement could change shape. This was not a good business model in the short term. In the slightly longer term, it produced clients who sent their friends. Daniel had not designed these characteristics as marketing. He had designed them as what the thing was supposed to be. The reputation followed because it was accurate. He was 36 when the first significant external recognition arrived. Not an award. He was skeptical of awards, having watched enough of them given to the wrong people to understand that they were better diagnostics of an institution's priorities than of actual merit. But a foundation, a national one, with resources significant enough to matter, reached out about a partnership. They had been watching Bridgeworks results for a year and a half. They had a program they were designing to bring the Bridgework methodology to 3 other cities, and they wanted Daniel's involvement. He took the meeting. He sat across from the Foundation's program director, a composed man named Lawrence who had the steady manner of someone who has spent a career in philanthropy and no longer needs to perform its virtues. And he listened to what was being proposed. It was, on its face, everything he would have said he wanted 2 years earlier. Scale, resources, national reach, the possibility of the methodology being applied in cities he had not yet reached. He said, "Tell me about the governance." Lawrence explained the governance. The Foundation would maintain oversight. Daniel and his team would develop the curriculum and the training. The local implementations would be run by local partners selected by the Foundation. Daniel said, "What is the selection criteria for the local partners?" Lawrence described the criteria. It was, Daniel thought, a reasonable criteria for an organization choosing partners efficiently at scale. It was not the criteria he would use for choosing partners who would actually carry the work correctly. He asked Lawrence, "How do you ensure that the listening quality transfers to the local implementations?" Lawrence said, "We have a strong training program." Daniel said, "Listening is not trained in programs. It is developed in practice over time, with a specific kind of feedback." He was not being difficult, he was being accurate. He had spent 5 years watching the listening develop in his team and he understood what it required. They talked for 2 more hours. The conversation was honest on both sides, which Daniel appreciated. Lawrence was not defensive. He pushed back where he disagreed and listened where he did not, and by the end of the conversation, something useful had been established. A clearer picture of what the partnership might look like if it was going to work. They agreed to a pilot, 1 city, not 3. A year, with genuine evaluation criteria agreed in advance. Daniel would be directly involved in the partner selection in that city. The training program would include an 18-month mentorship element, not the standard 8-week module. It was less than what Lawrence had originally proposed. It was more than Daniel had expected to get. He drove home that evening thinking about the difference between the offer that looks like everything you want and the offer that actually serves the thing you are building, and how often the two are not the same. He called Paul that evening. Paul, who had left healthcare administration and was now running a small program to bring financial literacy education to secondary schools in Cleveland, said, "You took the reduced version and you sound happier than if you had taken the full one." Daniel said yes. Paul said, "You know what that means?" Daniel said he knew. It meant the full version had something in it that was not right. Paul said, "The bread story." Daniel had told Paul about the bread story 3 years earlier, during one of their Sunday calls, one of the evenings when the thing being built needed to be spoken aloud to another person to remain solid. Paul had listened without comment, and then said, "That is your calibration instrument." Daniel had said he thought so. Paul had said, "I want to meet her someday." Daniel said he did not know if that was possible. Paul said, "Do you want to find her?" Daniel thought about this for a while. He was sitting in his apartment, a better one now, the 3rd he had lived in since leaving Fern Street, in a building that worked all the time, heating and elevator and all of it. He had a coffee cup in his hand. Through the window, the Columbus skyline was doing the thing it did in autumn when the light went low and the buildings held the gold. He said, "Finding her would make it about me." Paul was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is not wrong." Daniel said, "She did not give me bread so I could come back and thank her." Paul said, "No." Daniel said, "She gave me bread because I was there and I was hungry." Paul said, "Yes." Daniel said, "The thing I owe her is to keep being the kind of person who was worth giving the bread to." Paul did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That is good. That is actually really good." Daniel said, "I have been thinking about it for 3 years." Paul laughed. Daniel laughed. They talked about Paul's school program for a while, and then about Paul's daughter, who was 4 now and had developed an opinion about the correct color of cups that Paul described with the exhausted affection of a parent who loves the person responsible for the exhaustion. Daniel said the cup color opinions were a reasonable foundation for analytical thinking. Paul said he would tell his daughter that. Daniel said she would probably enjoy the validation. They talked until late. The Columbus skyline went dark. Daniel washed the coffee cup and put it away, and stood at the kitchen window for a while before going to bed. He thought about the pilot program. He thought about Lawrence and the Foundation, and the 1 city instead of 3. He thought about the team, Diane and Marcus and Oliver and Lucy and Karen, and the others who had joined over the years, all of them good at what they did, and all of them, in different ways, built the same way Daniel was built, from the understanding that the work mattered, and that the work mattered because the people it served mattered. He thought about Carl, who had kept his shop open, about Dennis, who had opened his third dry cleaning location, about Rita, the caterer, who had built a small but growing corporate events business out of the commercial kitchen she had been renting by the hour, about the second-generation bakery that was still open 3 blocks from the supermarket that had threatened to finish it. He thought about what his father's hands had looked like on the kitchen table. He thought about the bread. He went to bed with the window cracked slightly the way he had slept since the apartment on Fern Street, because some habits of the body are older than the reasons for them, and in the cold air from the window he felt the particular quality of a night that is resting from a day that was worth having. He slept well. The city was working on its own problems outside, as cities do, and he would come back to his in the morning, and the morning would be there when he arrived at it, patient as it always was. He had learned from his father that the day comes whether you are ready for it or not. He had learned from his mother that being ready was a practice, not a state you arrived at and kept. He had learned from Mrs. Aldrich that the extra problems were a gift. He had learned from Eugene that the thermos was enough. He had learned from Paul that friendship is what remains when everything else is accounted for. He had learned from the bread that some things do not need to be earned. They are given because there is need and there is something to give. That is the whole of it. He woke the next morning at 5:30 and made coffee, and sat at his desk and opened the notebook. He turned to the next page. He began. The pilot city was Pittsburgh. The bridgework methodology arrived there in the first week of March, in a city that was cold and specific, and had its own particular economy, shaped by the same forces that had shaped Columbus and Claremont and every other mid-size American city: the decline of manufacturing, the rise of services, the gap between the parts of the economy where growth was happening, and the communities that had not been carried forward by that growth. The local partner was a community development organization called Eastgate Initiative, which had been operating in the Pittsburgh neighborhood of Homewood for 11 years. Its director was a woman named Carol, which Daniel noticed with a small private feeling that he set aside, because he was not the kind of person who read meaning into coincidences of names. This Carol was 44, sharp and direct, with the quality of someone who has fought hard for a long time for things that deserve fighting for, and has not become cynical because she has chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to be. She was skeptical of bridgework at first. She said so, which Daniel appreciated. She had seen consulting organizations arrive in Homewood before, she said, with language about transformation and investment and capacity building, and she had watched most of them leave after a grant cycle with a report that described success in terms the affected communities would not have recognized, and a physical change in the neighborhood that was difficult to identify. She said this without anger, as information. Daniel said, "What would make this different?" She said, "If the businesses here feel, after a year, that they understand their own finances better than they did before. Not that you understand their finances. That they do," Daniel said. "That is exactly what success looks like to us." She looked at him with the evaluating look of someone who has heard many things said and has learned to listen for what underlies the saying. He held the look without performance. He was not trying to convince her. He was stating what was true. She said, "I will hold you to that." He said, "Please do." The Pittsburgh engagement was harder than Columbus. Not because the problems were different, they were structurally similar. Small businesses doing good work in communities that the market systematically underserved, facing challenges that were tractable if you had the framework to see them and the access to the tools to address them. It was harder because the trust was lower, for legitimate reasons. And lower trust meant slower intake, and the slower intake meant everything downstream took longer. Oliver went to Pittsburgh 4 days a week for the first 6 months. This was not easy. Oliver had a life in Columbus, a partner, an apartment, the specific texture of a daily life that gets disrupted by 4 days a week in another city. He went anyway because he was the right person for the intake work, and he knew it, and he had the character to do what the work required. Daniel increased his salary without Oliver asking. Oliver said thank you. They did not make a moment of it. By September, 4 months into the pilot, the numbers were telling a version of what Columbus had told in its first year, slower to start, building toward the same shape. Carol at Eastgate was watching carefully. She met with Daniel monthly, and she brought the numbers and the client feedback to the meetings in the same careful way she brought her skepticism, not to argue, to evaluate. In October, she said, "One of our clients told me something." Daniel said, "What did they tell you?" She said, "They told me that your team was the first financial people they had ever talked to who seemed to already understand what it was like to run a small business in this neighborhood before they walked in the door." Daniel said, "They understood that from the conversation?" She said, "They understood it because your team talked to them first, not about the numbers, about the business, about what it was like. Your team asked what it was like." Daniel said, "That is the intake." Carol said, "I know it is the intake. I am telling you it landed." There is a difference between doing the thing and the thing landing. He went home to Columbus that evening and sat at the kitchen table in his apartment. He had a kitchen table now, a real one, not the Fern Street kind, but a table that he had bought because he wanted a table and could buy it. He sat at it the way his father had sat at the kitchen table on Fern Street, with both hands flat against the surface, feeling that solid things existed. He was not his father. He had not come home with anything broken. He was sitting at the table because something had been confirmed, not because something had failed. But the posture was the same, and he felt in the posture the specific weight of continuity, the thread from the thin-walled house on Fern Street to this apartment, from his father's hands to his, from the coffee can behind the loose brick to the bridgework accounts that were no longer thin. He called his mother. She answered on the second ring, which was always how she answered, and her voice was the same voice, the one that noticed things. She said, "Is everything all right?" Not because something seemed wrong, because she always asked, because noticing was her language. He said everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. He had been in Pittsburgh. She said, "How is the work going?" He said, "I think it is going the way it is supposed to." She said, "Good." He said, "Mom." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you remember that afternoon when Dad came home and his lip was split? I was 7. He sat at the kitchen table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I remember." He said, "What happened that day?" She said, "There was a foreman. He made things difficult sometimes." He said, "I always thought about that, about what it would have meant if someone had come to help, not to fix it, just to help him see it from outside." She said, "He would have appreciated that." He said, "That is what I am trying to build." She was quiet again. Then she said, I know that is what you are building." He did not know how she knew. He had not described it to her in those terms. But Carol Holt had always understood the inside of things before they were explained to her, and she understood this too. He said good night. She said, "Take care of yourself." He sat at the table for a while after he hung up. He thought about how far the road was and how much of it was still ahead. He thought about the Pittsburgh engagement and the clients there, and the methodology, and what it would mean if it worked the way he believed it could. He thought about scale, not the large, impersonal scale of the investors and the corporate expansions, but the human scale, the number of dry cleaning owners and car shop owners and caterers and bakers who were good at what they did and running toward unseen walls, and the number of them who could be shown, from outside, what the wall was, and the number of walls that could come down. He thought about his father's hands. He thought about the bread. And then he thought about something he had not thought about before in exactly this way, the specific path between those two things. His father's hands on the table and the bread in his own hand. The distance between those two moments was 22 years of accumulated work, of choices made in specific directions, of things accepted and things declined, of notebooks filled and directions held to and gold refused, and a company built on the logic of the bread itself. The distance was his life. He was not sentimental about this. Sentiment is something you feel when the thing is over, and the thing was not over. He was 37. The work was in its 6th year. The Pittsburgh pilot was 5 months in. There were 4 more cities waiting if Pittsburgh worked. There were people in those cities running businesses that were failing in ways they could not see from inside, and the seeing from outside was the work, and the work was still ahead of him by a very significant margin. He was not done, not close to done. But sitting at the table with his hands flat against the surface, he understood something that he had been building toward understanding for a long time. The path was not accidental. Not in the sense that it had been planned from the beginning. It had not. The notebook from 14 had a plan, and the plan had changed many times, and the company he had built was not exactly what the 14-year-old had imagined, because the 14-year-old had been imagining from the inside of a problem he did not yet fully understand. But the direction had been constant. From the first line in the notebook, "I am going to leave," to the first year at Whitmore, to Graybridge, to Owen, to Charlotte and the investors and all the gold, to Carl's shop and the Westland district and the church steps and the bread. The direction had not changed. He had been moving toward the same thing the whole time. He had just not known, until the bread, what it felt like to arrive at it. He had known since the bread what he was aiming for. He pushed his chair back and stood up and put the kettle on because a cup of tea seemed like the right thing. And while the water heated, he stood at the kitchen window and looked at the city, and thought about Pittsburgh and Oliver at the intake tables, and Carol at Eastgate holding him to the promise. And he felt the specific satisfaction of a person who is doing what they are supposed to be doing, which is one of the rarest feelings available in a life, and one of the most worth protecting. The kettle came to a boil. He made the tea. He sat back down at the table and drank it slowly, with both hands around the cup in the way he had drunk hot things since childhood, when the kitchen was cold and a hot cup was its own kind of warmth. He sat there for a long time. The city was quiet around him. Something had been built that was going to outlast the building of it. He did not know yet how far it would reach. He would find out. He was good at finding things out. He finished the tea. He put the cup in the sink. He went to bed. The morning would come and the work would be there and he would meet it the way he always had. At the desk at 5:30 with the notebook open and the pen in his hand and the direction clear. He was not afraid of the morning. He had never been afraid of the morning. He had been afraid of other things. The cold uncertainty, the thin margin, the gold that kept arriving and needed to be refused, the moments when the direction was hard to see. He had been afraid of those things in the way that anyone who is actually doing something is afraid, not frozen by the fear, just aware of it and moving anyway. The moving was the point. He had learned this at 7, watching his father's hands on the table. He had confirmed it at 14 with the notebook behind the loose brick. He had practiced it through every stage of the road from Fern Street to here. He would practice it again tomorrow. That was enough. More than enough. He slept. The thing about a life, Daniel understood by the time he was 39, is that it does not divide into the chapters you write when you are planning it. It divides into before and after certain ordinary moments that did not announce their significance. A second-place certificate in a cold winter. A 4-page letter from a retired teacher. A man in a parking lot saying you are smarter than this place. Hands flat on a kitchen table. A piece of bread from a woman who asked nothing. He was at a conference in Washington that spring. Not the kind of conference he would have attended 5 years earlier. Not a finance conference. Not a business development conference. This was a gathering of people working at the intersection of economic justice and small business development, organized by a policy institute that had been tracking the work of organizations like Bridgework for 3 years. Daniel had been invited to speak on a panel. He had accepted because the audience was the right audience and because Owen Harper had said, "You should go," and Owen Harper's suggestions had the specific quality of things worth following. He was not the most prominent person on the panel. He was the youngest. The others were a state-level economic development officer, the director of a large community development financial institution, and a professor who studied small business survival in low-income neighborhoods with the precision that academics bring to things that affect people quietly and without drama. The panel was moderated by a journalist who asked the kind of questions that look simple and are not. Why does this matter? Why now? What does success look like and how do you know when you have it? Daniel answered his questions with the care he always brought to questions that deserved care. He said that success, in his model, looked like a client who understood their own numbers better at the end of the engagement than they did at the beginning. He said this was both the practical goal and the philosophical one, not to create dependency on expertise, but to distribute the capacity to see clearly. He said that the dry cleaning owner and the car shop owner and the baker had the same right to understand the financial mechanics of their own business that any corporate executive had, and that the gap was not one of intelligence or commitment, but of access, and that access, structured correctly, could be bridged. A woman in the audience asked a question afterward, during the open session. She was in her late 40s, with the look of someone who had been doing difficult work for a long time, and had not been worn down by it, but had been changed by it in the way good work changes people. She said, "You talk about the methodology as if it comes from a specific place. Where did it come from?" The panel moderator said the question was for Daniel. He thought about the question for a moment. The room was watching him in the way audiences watch speakers who have said something that has made them curious about the speaker. He said, "It came from paying attention to what was missing in everything I encountered on the way to building it." She said, "What was missing?" He said, "The willingness to give something without terms. To help, because the person in front of you needs it, not because of what they can become, or what they represent, or what it does for your account." She said, "Where did you see that?" He said, "From people in my life who did it. My mother, a teacher, a man who volunteers at a community center with a thermos full of coffee. And one afternoon, from a woman I had never met who gave me something to eat because I was hungry." The room was quiet. He said, "None of them were building a brand. None of them were positioning for recognition. They just gave what they had to the person who needed it. That is the model. I have been trying to replicate that at scale for 10 years. She nodded. She did not say anything else. He went back to Columbus the next morning. He had 3 meetings that week. One with Diane about a new client intake process she had been developing, one with the Lawrence Foundation about the expansion of the pilot to a second city, one with a community college that had reached out about a partnership to incorporate financial literacy into their small business certificate programs. All three were good meetings. Not easy. None of the meetings in the last 10 years had been easy. Not in the specific way of things that are doing what they are supposed to do. But good. Moving in the direction they were supposed to move. On Friday evening he drove to Claremont. He did this every few months. His parents were older now. George 74, Carol 71. George's shoulders had rounded further. His hands still had the metalwork dust in the creases, though he had been retired for 4 years. Carol moved a little more slowly but still noticed everything. The house on Fern Street was the same house, the same thin walls and the same television, though the picture no longer rolled because Daniel had replaced it the Christmas before last with a new one that Carol had called unnecessary and had thanked him for every time he visited since. He sat at the kitchen table. Carol made dinner. George fell asleep in the chair with the remote on his chest, as he always did, and Daniel covered him with the blanket from the arm of the couch, as he always did. Carol washed dishes and Daniel dried, and they talked about ordinary things. The neighbors, the weather, a program Carol was watching. The community college partnership Daniel mentioned because he could mention his work to his mother in a way that needed no translation. She said, "You are giving people the outside view." He said, "That is right." She said, "Like what you would have wanted for your father." He said, "Yes." She handed him a dish to dry. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He was proud of you. He never said it the right way, but he was." Daniel said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes, I do." She handed him another dish. He stood in the kitchen on Fern Street and dried his parents' dishes, the same dishes from the same cabinet that had always been there, and the familiar weight of the kitchen and the house and the street outside was not heavy. It was ballast. It was the thing that kept you knowing which direction was down, so you could know which direction was up. He drove back to Columbus later that evening. He had the notebook on the passenger seat, which was where it always wrote on these drives, not because he wrote while driving, but because he sometimes pulled over and wrote when something came clear and he did not want to lose it before he got home. He pulled over once. He wrote 3 sentences. He looked at them for a while. Then he drove the rest of the way home, and the Ohio night was cold and clear and full of the particular silence of a long road where you know where you are going and you know what you are going to do when you get there, and the road itself is only the road, and that is more than enough. He did not know, pulling into Columbus late that evening, that the following year would bring the national recognition he had not sought and would not have predicted, and would need to be navigated carefully so that it did not change the thing he had built into something that resembled the thing he had been offered and had declined. He did not know that the Lawrence Foundation's expansion would go to 4 cities, not 2, and that the model would produce results in those cities that would make the case for what he had believed since 14. He did not know that Eugene, the volunteer at the community center with the thermos, would finally accept a modest paid position when Bridgework formalized its volunteer program, and that he would arrive on his first official day and say, "Nothing changes except the paperwork." He did not know these things because they had not happened yet. He knew the things that were true now. The company was real. The work was real. The people doing it were real. Carl's shop was open. Dennis had his 3rd dry cleaning location. Rita's catering business served events she had not imagined possible 5 years ago. The baker's family was still baking. He parked the car and got out and stood in the cold for a moment. He thought about the bread, the warmth of it, the weight of it in his hand on the October afternoon, when the light was low and golden, and a woman he did not know gave it to him because he was hungry and she had it to give. He thought, "I have not forgotten." He went inside. He put the kettle on. He opened the notebook to the 3 sentences he had written on the side of the road and read them again. They said, "You do not have to be seen giving it. You only have to give it. That is the whole of the thing." He closed the notebook. He made the tea. He sat at the table in the quiet apartment and drank it slowly, in no hurry, in the specific peace of a person who has found the work they were meant to do and has not lost it. The city was quiet outside. The notebook sat on the table. The cloth napkin was still on the desk in the next room, where it had been for 11 years, a small square of folded cloth that nobody had ever asked about and he had never explained, because some things do not need explaining and some things cannot be explained, and the difference between those 2 categories is where the most important things in a life tend to live. He finished the tea. He sat for another moment in the silence. Then he stood and washed the cup and set it on the rack to dry and went to bed. Outside, the Ohio night was doing what Ohio nights do in autumn, turning cold at the edges, the particular cold that arrives before winter and means what it says. It was the kind of cold that George Holt had worked in for 21 years at the factory on the early shift. The kind that Carol Holt had stood in at bus stops on the north side, waiting, 3 days a week for 20 years. Daniel had come from that cold. He had carried it with him the whole way. Not as weight, as knowledge. The knowledge of what it costs to keep things going when the cold is real, and the warmth costs money, and the money is not certain. The knowledge that the people most worth helping are usually the people most skilled at not asking for it, because they have been told, one way or another, that the asking is the thing that marks you. He had been marked. He knew what it felt like. He had built something for the people who were marked the same way. He had built it without forgetting where it came from. He had not forgotten the bread. He would not forget the bread. In the morning he would be at his desk at 5:30. The notebook would be open. The pen would be in his hand. The whiteboard would be there with the framework and the names and the map of what was next. Diane would arrive early with coffee from the corner. Marcus would arrive exactly on time. Oliver would check in from Pittsburgh, where the work was still in progress and the clients were beginning to trust. The work would be there. He would meet it. He always did. He slept, and the city moved around him in the particular rhythm of a place that does not stop. And somewhere on the east side in a 2-bedroom apartment with plants in the windows, Helen Park was sleeping too, unaware that the man she had given bread to 11 years ago had built something that was keeping 43 businesses open in 3 cities, unaware that the cloth napkin from her table sat folded on a desk in an office she had never visited, unaware that she was, in some way that could not be accounted for on any ledger she would have recognized, the reason. She would have pushed back on that. She had given bread. He had done the rest. 2 separate things. Both true. Both complete. Both worth everything they had cost.